The other day, Flashlight Kid and I went to our local junkyard because he needed to get an alternator from one of the junk vehicles here. We saw a couple cool things, and as we were leaving, we saw an E90 tucked away in the corner. I got a bit curious, so I walked up, wiped the window, and lo and behold, it has a manual transmission. So of course that ended up piquing my curiosity, so I got the key and wanted to take a peek to see how it ran, and lo and behold, it has 393,000 kilometers. Holy hell. Alright, so the kid told me he had good news and bad news for me. Good news being the tires were good, but bad news that there was a dent. Me. How did I not notice that? Well, when you make poor life choices, there's your sold sign and your new to you E90. Thanks to Larry from Pick and Pull for delivering my new to me whip here. Of course, any other BMW that you would get, especially sight unseen without knowing the history, it has a bunch of lights. We're going to ignore all of these for now and admire the perfection that is the E90 BMW here. The goal for this video is going to be making this thing a little bit quicker on a modest budget of $100. So we head to our local Canadian Tire to grab some seafoam, some fresh oil because we have no idea how old that thing is, some sketchy looking spark plugs, and our budget of $100 went out the window. As easy as that. Oh yeah, and by the way, every time you take off from a stop, it throws the trunk light because it thinks the trunk is open even though you slammed it. Since the lifters were a bit noisy and sticking, the first step is to put some seafoam into the crankcase to loosen up any gunk that would have been plugging it up. Next, we're going to be spraying off this engine bay because it looks like it rolled through a mud pit. We're going to soak it down as soon as it's hot and leave it to marinate a little bit. Give it a quick spray down, and ironically, as soon as we go to spray the water off, there was no gloss or polish on the paint, so the soap just stuck. After you put seafoam into the crankcase, it's a good rule of thumb to drive it above 3,000 RPM for a few minutes at a time. First order of business is draining the oil. It looked like somebody was off-roading this thing because there was a bunch of caked up mud everywhere. As soon as the oil started to drain, it was really watery. It didn't look too bad, but it was definitely due. Let's just say at this point, I started to question my life choices and sanity. We open the oil cap just to make sure that we end up getting all of the oil and it doesn't splash all over the place. We pull the filter out, which didn't initially look too bad, but upon further inspection between the pleats of the oil filter, we saw a little bit of grit and grime and not really sure where that came from, so we're just going to pretend we didn't see that and throw the filter in the garbage. Ironically, I ended up having a bunch of filters sitting on the shelf, and an N54 one was the exact same one we needed. You can see them side by side. One is obviously worn. Ironically, it showed BMW on it, but yeah, we're going to throw a fresh one in regardless. Looking around the engine bay, everything looked pretty good, and inside of the oil filter housing, surprisingly, there was no stripper glitter. So, yeah, hell yeah, why not? Throw a new filter in, snug it up, and fill it with some fresh dinosaur juice. Here we end up putting some high mileage oil stabilizer in it. This is essentially a super thick honey. After I end up running seafoam through the engine to clean up the lifters and whatnot, on a higher mileage vehicle, I'll usually put this stuff in just to help the hydraulic lifters maintain their prime. We go back to the dinosaur juice and we ended up just pouring it so that it would end up hitting the bottom since that honey is going to be a pain. And next step, we're going to start by removing the cowl to access the spark plugs. Working on a car that actually has all of the original bolts and plugs in place is kind of nice, but holy, was this thing a disaster. We ended up spraying the engine bay, but underneath, man, it looked like it rolled through a mud pile. The coils were a little bit stuck in there, so I just used an extension or the end of a ratchet to pull them out. They ended up looking like the original ones, and on an NA vehicle, it's really not the end of the world. They all ended up matching, but of course they looked like an absolute disaster. The spark plugs were stuck in there quite good, so I had to use a little bit of effort and smack it with my purse on a couple of them, but they ended up coming loose, and fortunately I was able to get all 6 out without an issue. I don't know if you guys are ready to see this, but here we are. Holy, are these bad. When I ended up measuring just the one of them, it was over double what it should normally be. 75 thou, and I think the new ones were 40? Yeah, that's a little bit comical. I've never seen plugs so bad, and I've changed probably thousands at this point. Starting with cylinder 2 and the remaining 3, 4, all the way to 6, they were equally as bad, and all it did was make me laugh and, again, question life choices. Of course, on the Carfax that they ended up supplying me, it has 2 service records, so there's, needless to say, there was questionable history on this nearly 400,000 kilometer vehicle. We're definitely going to be replacing these plugs, so we're going to be checking the gap on these new iridium plugs that we got from Canadian Tire. Good thing to put a little bit of dielectric right on the electrode of the plug. It makes it easier to take the spark plug socket out when the spark plug is installed, and on the boots for the coils themselves, a little bit more doesn't hurt. So we just ended up finishing the oil change on the spark plugs, and you can see how bad they were. I think that's a bit of an understatement, but I did find this little toy. I'm sure the majority of you know exactly what this is, so we figure, why the hell not? Let's try it. What we're gonna do, just for shits and giggles, is we're gonna drag it before, and we're gonna do some ghetto cheat mods and see if it improves at all. If it does, fantastic, because it's not gonna break your wallet or the budget. But if rumors are true, it could also make the car slower. So we're gonna find out firsthand. We're in good old Mexico. They have some snow for this season. I know, unheard of, but it was a long drive to bring you that content. What we're gonna do, because this thing is a little anemic, we're gonna do 60 to 120 kilometers an hour on a closed road, just because it'll be within 1 gear and it'll be a good direct apples to apples, reducing variables on the 2-3 shift. So we're just going to leave it in 3rd gear. We're going to go right through the rev band and or rev range and see what it does. The nice thing is currently we don't have to press the DTC button because it has the trifecta light. So it's rear wheel drive. So what I'll do is I'll put my foot down around 55 and record that torque. Shows 8.80 seconds. I don't know if that's good or bad or whatever. Typically big horsepower cars will do, I think it's 60, 130, 100 to 200. I don't think this thing can do 200. So rather than taking years off your life, we're just going to do 60, 120 kilometers an hour on this closed circuit. One other thing is this one is showing a little bit of a slope. So to take out all variables, we're going to go back the exact same way, and we'll end up taking the lower of the 2 and yeah, see what it does. Foot down. Oh my God, it's so fast! Whoa, it's floating. Okay, so that one was 9.14. So it looks like there was, that slope may have played a factor. So what we'll do is we'll ensure when we end up going back the same way, we're gonna have it around the same temperature and see if it can beat 8.8. Since I blew the budget and blew it pretty badly, what we're gonna have to resort to is free mods. So you can see here this big intake with its sort of ram air. Now what we might be able to do is I do have some hood scoops to be able to pull some fresh air into the airbox, but along with that, the panel filter inside of here is pretty restrictive, and the way I understand it is it does end up having a secondary screen, being that it's 400,000 kilometers and the screen is non-replaceable. I have a bad feeling it's going to be plugged up. So we're going to have to use some ghetto engineering and get this one sorted. It should make it faster marginally, depending on how plugged it is and how bad it is, but in the least, it's gonna make it sound a hell of a lot cooler. So, I mean, win-win. Well, let's just say when you hold this up to the light, better yet, let me put an extremely bright light behind it. Can you see much of it? Not really. So that means the integrated filter is unbelievably plugged, which I fully expect for 400,000 kilometers. Well, that's kind of ironic. So the panel filter is cleaner than that pre-filter charcoal thing. Of course, we're gonna blow this out with just compressed air because I have no budget, so I can't afford a $20 filter, which is fine. But this we're gonna have to tackle at some point. So I need to find a nice way of removing it. Something slightly important, and because I don't want stuff to get all over these little pieces of fabric, is I'm gonna run a lighter on it just to torch the rest of it. Probably don't need to do this, but I'd prefer not to have some fabric randomly getting ingested into the engine. Since this airbox ends up sitting in here, the MAF sits in here, sometimes what you can do is you can chop the end off here to mount an air filter. So ideally, it would have been fantastic to mount an air filter, something like that, so you get a lot of induction noise. But unfortunately, because it's so close, we're not able to trim it. And we obviously want it to still be able to filter oil, well, not oil, but dust and dirt. And it has a built-in velocity stack here. So some of you have seen exactly what we've done previously. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put the factory filter back in without that plugged secondary filter, and we're gonna Swiss cheese this airbox. So as you can see, it's a bit of a Swiss cheese mod because it looks like Swiss cheese. When we couldn't afford to do an intake back in the day on any of our newer vehicles, or new to us at the time, or if they were way too much, $400 or $500, you would do something like this and it essentially replicates a short ram intake and you get all of the induction noise. Before we go to throw this back in, I noticed that this has an intake resonator on it, which is unacceptable. We're left with a bit of a hole here, and when we ended up chopping it off, there's these two side holes that we need to cover. So I did find this magnetic plate, and yes, I agree it's ghetto, but we're gonna fix this here. We're gonna use two self-tap screws and a bit of silicone or hot glue underneath to make sure it doesn't fall out. It'll plug the hole, we'll throw it back together and see what it sounds like. We're not gonna take it to a muffler shop, so we're gonna do a bit of a DIY. I figured no point in changing the norm of what I would do, so we're gonna just whoosh, with the hacksaw. Oops. Oh. I'm sure there were more graceful ways of doing that. Feels like the muffler was full of water. So where I ended up cutting it, it's not gonna end up giving us a problem because it's behind the rear axle and all the hangers are still holding it. Sometimes what happens when you cut the muffler off, you'll get some smell in the cabin, but that thing's 50 pounds. So not only did we drop 50 pounds out of the car, probably gonna sound a lot better. Speaking of weight reduction, I did consider taking the doors off, taking the interior out, which will make a car lighter, in turn make it quicker, but it's winter and I don't feel like doing that. So 50 pounds off the muffler, let's see what it does. Maybe the muffler was packed or full or plugged, but with the intake, I think we're gonna have an improvement. Okay, we're gonna give it a quick start and see what it sounds like. Hey, doesn't sound so bad. It's actually not that bad. Now, lots of people are gonna say, oh yeah, see, it's blowing out all the water. So from it sitting, I'm sure that the resonators and cats and everything are gonna be full of actual water. So eventually it'll all blow out. And my biggest concern was that the muffler was sitting in water. But something like this, if you end up adding pipe to where you end up cutting it off, you can get a rasp in some drone. So where we cut it off, we're not overly concerned with it end up smelling inside of the cabin because these are sealed up pretty good. But yeah, you'll end up seeing there's a bit of condensation. It really doesn't sound that bad. It actually sounds pretty good. Another very important mod for this race car. Perfect. Along with everything that we've done, good practice is to reset all of the adaptations. You can definitely tell that this has not had anything done anytime recent. So what we're gonna do is plug in our trusty MHD dongle, let it connect, and use Pro Tools to reset it. Forgot one more mod. Let's give it a little bit of Red Bull here. Drink up. I heard it gives you wings. And this little anemic 328 needs all the help it can. So we're on our way to Mexico. The snow's kind of melted, as you would expect for a place that's relatively warm. And as soon as we get there to our private runway, we'll end up putting the foot down and crossing our fingers that the time is a little bit quicker. If it's not or worse, then it's not going to be great. But it sure does sound a lot better. You can't really tell on the video here, but it does definitely sound better. Oh man, I tell you, we've got ourselves a race car here. All right, gonna make a right-hand turn. Gonna get it up to third gear, foot down. Hey, 8.5! It actually did quite a bit. Oh, weird. Okay, here, we'll do another one right here. This is the exact piece of road. Foot down. .49! No way! Oh, that's wicked! We dropped almost a half second. And it hasn't misfired. So identical piece of road. If anything, it's just a little bit warmer today because yesterday it was quite cold. 8.49 compared to 8.8. Man, that is awesome. Oh, that is awesome. Good little car. Since we did the exact same thing in the exact same piece of road yesterday, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do one on the way back to compare the slopes there and back, just so we have apples to apples. .84. Okay, that's a pretty big improvement. Well, not big, it's good, but obviously 9.1 whatever to 8.84. Initially 8.8 on the opposite way to 8.49. Sweet. Oh, that's awesome. I'm telling you, this thing got a few wings, and I think that Red Bull actually did something. Forget the airbox mod, forget the, you know, chop muffler and whatever else. Feed your car some Red Bull. Well, there you have it. That's our 328. I didn't expect it to actually pick up power, let alone get a little bit quick. but for obvious reasons it was a bit neglected, but all in all it seems to be a half decent car. What do you guys think we should end up doing with this? I've kind of thrown around the idea of maybe a little bit of an autocross setup on the cheap, maybe some coilovers, wheels and so forth, but I really didn't expect, being my first N52, that it would actually be pretty fun to drive. Let me know what you think we should do down in the comments, and as always, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.